Will you resign?
No, but I will stand down from all my portfolios, please.
God, no, please don't. Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moyer, and with me today I have Mark Daughter and Tim Murphy. Today we're going to break down the latest poll, the strategies, the ups and downs and the below the belts of the last week in politics. And to wrap up, we'll offer some recommendations. It has been quite a week. I feel like we say this quite often, Mark, but it has been a week in Parliament this week. So this is going to be a bit more of a free-flowing conversation rather than a couple of topics. We're just going to have a big old chat about how things have been going. We're going to have a look at every party, I think. They've all had their ups and their downs this week. I think a good starting point, though, Tim, let's go back to the beginning of the week when, of course, we had the National Party announce at the weekend its candidate list for the election this year. Obviously, big attempt with that list by Christopher Luxon. It was his last chance to get that diversity into a potential future caucus and cabinet as a result of what we've talked about before, which was a lot of males with not a lot of ethnic diversity in those particularly winnable or potentially winnable seats for National. The kind of big surprise factor in all of that was Michael Woodhouse basically announcing his retirement because he was unhappy with where he landed on that list, seeing it as him basically not being considered for a ministerial position if they were to be in government. How did you read that list, Tim, in terms of whether they've actually ticked boxes around getting better diversity, bearing in mind what they ended up with at the 2020 election was pretty dire on that front?
Well, first thing is don't mention the word gender. National is not having gender as a factor in any of these deliberations. Look, getting the list into a sort of a gender or diverse representative state is one thing. Getting your elected members of your next caucus is something different again. And National won't achieve that because, as you've pointed out, Jo, in the seats, the safe seats that it will win, it's selected a whole lot of other men. White young men, and so that the attempts they've made have been, I guess, to follow through on what they wanted to sort of be seen to be doing, but it's the end result that'll matter really. It's been bizarre that National won't use the word or at least take the factor of gender into consideration publicly since. Because Christopher Luxon has wanted that in the past. Nicola Willis wouldn't even go there with you, Jo, I think, the other day. But their own press release highlighted gender in its first few words when they announced their list. So it's plainly a factor, as it should be and as everyone expected it to be. But it's just weird that they feel that might put them offside with some voters.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of explored that idea in a comment piece this week and whether it was to do with some of the public sentiment that has been coming through in some of those public meetings that Christopher Luxon has been doing around the country and that sort of anti-woke rhetoric that is existing and the fact that, National seems to be quite fearful of losing any votes at the moment to ACT as ACT continues to do well in the polls that we've been seeing. Is that your sort of read on it, Mark, that basically National was like, oh, well, we wouldn't want National Party members who have picked these predominantly white men in these seats to go, oh, gosh, you're talking about gender. We can't have that. Let's go vote for David Seymour.
Yeah, I think there is an aspect of that. There's a question as to how representative it is. Like we've spoken about a few times in the past, the things you hear at public meetings, not by definition representative of what your general constituents are thinking, because those audiences aren't necessarily representative. There's another element there for the people who have selected these candidates in the local seats about, is the party trying to move in a different direction from where we feel the party should be? Should they be reading that as a rebuke of their choices? As much as Luxon has tried to sort of keep an eye on selection processes since the Sam Uffindale stuff, I think he's still conscious that, he's the leader of a caucus and he's nominally the leader of a party, but it's a party that's been there for a lot longer than he has, and a lot of its members have a lot more of a history with it, and so it's something to be sort of cautious about.
I mean, if you look at that list too, Tim, there's not actually going, based on sort of the polling numbers we're seeing, there's not going to be a whole heap of new people that come in, right? You're going to have basically your top 20 effectively is current MPs, and then there's some new people that come in after that. There's some people they want to come in on the list. So you've got James Christmas, for example, and I think Agnes Lohini is in there in a position that would be winnable. Gets down to maybe someone like Paulo Garcia as well, who was formerly an MP. You know, Agnes Lohini, also formerly an MP. These aren't particularly new people for the National Party. So it's all very well for Chris Luxon to have kind of touted this as experience plus seasoned MPs who will become a minister in his government plus all this new talent. But how much new talent is there going to be? I'm just not convinced that there will be a whole heap, and where it will be very much on the backbenches. Is that a fairly fair assessment?
Yeah, Joe, I think you're right, but I think it'd be right of every party and its list that most of the new talent coming in is going to end up backbench if they're in government or opposition, really. So I think basically people are voting at the moment. The polls are showing us what people make of the current lineups of these parties. So this is just icing on the top, if you like. Yes, you might be able to show that we're not a bunch of deadheads or we are reaching out to other communities, but people are giving you your rating at the moment on what they see, not what they imagine you might come up with. So National sits where it does at whatever, 37% and heading north. They're probably quite confident that who they've got there now gives them the sort of the pack of cards or the hand of cards that they need to play. One thing that interested me, and I need to ask you guys because I'm not sure of it, is with ACT, do they ever make a virtue of selecting diversely or trying to put together a list that is of diverse nature? Or is ACT purist on this and say it's a meritocracy in ACT, and if you're good, you're at the top, and if you're all men at the top, that's fine?
Well, funnily enough, I actually asked David Seymour about this week after Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis were beside themselves trying to not say that gender had been a factor in their diversity list that was specifically related to gender. And David Seymour was quite frank that no, that would never come into consideration for the ACT party. He used the word that would be considered discrimination. And that when it comes to how they select their list, it's very much they go through sort of an application process, an interview process, and it's very much about picking the candidates that they think will most represent and put forward ACT's policies and what it is that they are trying to achieve. I asked the same question too of Te Pāti Māori, and their response was that while they don't specifically take gender into consideration, they come at it from sort of a tikanga base. And what that means is that they kind of look at broadly how people fit into Māoridom and the different roles that are played. And obviously women are actually quite an important role when you look at it with that lens. And so you, as a result, have women feature quite prominently high up in these sorts of positions and lists like you're seeing at the moment with Debbie Ngāri Wapeka and Mika Whaitiri, for example. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting talking to the parties about how they work this stuff out.
Imagine what the ACT Party's psychometric or aptitude testing questionnaire will be like. We need to see this.
See if we can get our hands on a copy. We'll let you know. I think probably this is a good opportunity too to talk about the polling. We've already alluded to it. Mark, can you just give us a bit of a run through? You have obviously, I'm going to plug it now, created a great resource on Newsroom where you can do sort of comparisons with different polls and work out where parties have been previously versus where they are now, etc. Everyone should go check it out. But where are we at with where the polls have been, how things have been moving around for a potential next term, and then how that One News poll this week has kind of changed that up a bit?
Yeah, I think the polls have been sort of moving in a particular direction, and the One News poll solidified that direction, which is National flat at 35 at worst, and in some cases rising, and Labour falling, and generally the right bloc either flat or growing, and the left bloc falling. The One News poll has an 8-point gap between Labour and National, which is really sizable. It tells you actually that this trend that we've been seeing, where you could argue things are within margin of error, there's no margin of error here. It's National is ahead of Labour and the right bloc is ahead of the left. And so what it would mean is a National Act government pretty comfortable with well over the 61 seats that they need to govern.
So how has that played out in the House this week then? Because you've had Chris Hipkins kind of have this poll that's a public poll that says obviously there's a decent margin between the two that is beyond the margin of error. You've had him actually admit this week too that Labour's internal polling is about the same. Not quite, so the read seems to be that they're not on 29 but they're probably on 30. How has that impacted the way that Chris Hipkins has been kind of responding this week, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's been pretty vocal about that, it's time to start campaigning. We've seen over the past couple of weeks the policies are starting to come out, and now he's casting Labour basically as the underdog in the election. He says that they're going to be fighting hard, fighting back, and putting scrutiny is the term he likes to use on the opposition's policies and what a National Act government would look like. Clearly, there's a sense there that he doesn't necessarily feel that we've done the best job of placing the scrutiny on the opposition, which I would disagree with, but that's okay. In the House, we've seen that with him, basically mocking ACT's scenario, where they've had this week a couple of their candidates further down on their list turn out to be anti-vaxxers, anti-mandate kind of people, and some of those people have gone, and Chris Hipkins delighted in the opportunity to whack David Seymour with it, and even to hit National for having to partner with ACT in the end if they are in a position to govern. So, I think we can see it's a gloves-off scenario, and he's got some punches to throw.
Tim, can we just briefly mention the absurdity that is Chris Hipkins talking about Labour being the underdog when they are currently a party in Parliament with a single-party majority for the first time ever under MMP?
He's not wrong, actually, Joe, though. For the number of months, really, other than that brief time where he took over from Jacinda Ardern and things started to perk up, go right back past that to late last year, National and ACT had been looking and have been looking like they're on to a winning tide. So he's probably just decided that there's no point pretending anymore. They are underdog now. They are up against it. What shocked me from that poll and the makeup of the Parliament and seats, I think, Mark, and you might correct me, that it put Labour down at 37 seats, and that's from 65. That's an astonishing loss of your personnel and your colleagues and your talent for some time later, and for a return to government in 3, 6, 9 years. That is an enormous loss. And so, you are underdogs when you're looking at polls telling you that.
I guess I would say it is a loss and it isn't a loss. If you think about the people who are on the bottom end of that list, it's not necessarily your future ministers anyway.
What are you saying about these people, Mark?
You're always going to have to come down from 65. No one expected it to be at 65 forever. The scale of the drop, though, is significant, like you say.
Well, I mean, that point that you're making was reflected in a valedictory speech, which we're going to talk about later, with Emily Henderson, who literally stood up and said she never expected to be in Parliament. She was so far down the list and obviously didn't expect to win a seat, and has ended up in Parliament and has, after 2.5 years, said, this is not for me, I'm going back to reading books. The other thing that was interesting in that poll, the preferred PM. Now, that has been the thing that Chris Hipkins and Labour have been able to say, okay, the party's taking a bit of a dive, but just people actually just prefer Chris Hipkins, and that's kind of the silver lining, and has been held up as the silver lining in every poll over the last few months as that trend has started to more and more go down. You saw with the One News poll this week, 21% for Chris Hipkins, preferred PM, Chris Luxon 20%. So nothing in it at all, which is absolutely fascinating to me, because there has been a lot of rhetoric and, this narrative has been running that Chris Luxon is just not likeable. We've talked about it ourselves here. What's changed that, do you think, Tim?
Well, it hasn't changed it. He's only on 20 still. Sorry to be contrary, Joe, but he's no more likeable because he's on 20 and the other guy's on 21.
Strangely, I actually agree with you, Tim. It's that they're both unlikable at this point.
Well, this is the thing. He's closing in on almost on top of Hipkins, because Hipkins fell and is falling. and has fallen from what Jacinda Ardern was and from what Key was in the old days. And, so this new normal is of two leaders trundling along and barely acceptable preferred Prime Minister and I think, well, maybe not the trust thing. I haven't seen the trust figures in detail, but the truth of it is they're both just trolling along the bottom.
One other thing that's probably worth mentioning as well, what the kind of strategy is here, and I guess that problems that might still happen for all parties across the course of the campaign. Just looping back to Michael Woodhouse at the start of this, he obviously ended up being a problem for Christopher Luxon to have to talk about when you would think that it would have been a fairly straightforward list announcement for Luxon, especially because, he was excited about having this majority of women in the top 40. Tim, it's been interesting seeing the Woodhouse stuff play out this week. What has your take been on that?
Well, on one level, you might be, as a leader, taken aback to be sort of facing this kind of right field attack on your party when you're thinking you're in a good space. But on another level, people have egos, and plainly from what Woodhouse said in his interviews, Luxon doesn't really like Woodhouse much. Woodhouse sort of said, I like him, or I admire him, or whatever he said, but asked whether Luxon liked him, he was sort of non-committal. So plainly, shouldn't have been a total shock that someone who's been sort of sidelined by you would come out and criticise that. I thought that was great, that parting interview, for a couple of things. People reveal things when they're unguarded and they have nothing to lose. And he tells us that, Judith Collins could be our next foreign minister. So, talofa.
I just want to bring you in here, Mark. We've also had Tim van der Molen, which has been a really good show of how things can just kind of pop up out of nowhere and leaders have to deal with it. Tim van der Molen obviously now in contempt of Parliament and is going to be has been censored by the Privileges Committee. Made a public apology on Thursday in the House to Shannon Halbert, who he has been described as acting in a threatening manner towards. Just loop us in here. How has Chris Luxon responded to this, and has he done a good job, I guess, of cleaning up something that's a little bit untidy?
Yeah, he was pretty quick to react by standing Tim van der Molen down from all of his portfolios. He said there's he believes in second chances. There's a way back, but that this was not the appropriate behavior, not professional behavior. It serves sort of as a contrast to how Chris Hipkins struggled to deal with some of his ministerial improprieties earlier in the year. But I also think that to some extent that's not necessarily a fair comparison. Tim van der Molen is not in National Shadow Cabinet. He's actually the lowest ranked sitting MP on their list. So he's a really easy person to stomp on. And the behavior here is just so clearly out of line, standing over someone, telling them to stand up and implying, according to the independent review, that there was going to be some sort of physical confrontation potentially. It's easy to look at that and go, stand you down. Chris Hipkins had these gray areas, these borderline issues that then kept going and rolling out of control. And so it shows that Luxon is doing the thing he said he would in terms of managing his team, with an iron fist. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if he was to face a scenario like Chris Hipkins did, where someone in his top 10 or his top 20 was, caught in a borderline area, we don't know exactly how Luxon would react.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say Tim van der Molen did not meet his KPIs.
Did you notice that the barrister who advised the Privileges Committee apparently found that he'd been, quotes, objectively threatening? Now, if you guys can explain to me what an objective threat is compared to a subjective threat, I'd love to know it. I need to make a small kind of grudging and glancing apology here, because on this podcast a week or two ago, I kind of implied that the complaint against van der Molen might have been sort of politically influenced to get National on the back foot over bullying matters that Labor had been facing. Plainly it wasn't. Plainly van der Molen was out of order and not in a pleasant situation or scene. So I take that back.
Good to get that cleared up. Thank you, Tim.
Will you resign?
No, but I will stand down from all my portfolios, please.
God, no, please don't. Our audience question this week is, did anyone take Tim Murphy's advice on how to deliver a good valedictory speech? Tim, have you been listened to?
No, short answer is no, Joe. MPs seem unable They cannot be turned from giving a good part of their final speech in this House to very low-level thanks to everybody in their electorate and their office and the parliamentary complex and the media and the people who sort of tie their ties and polish their shoes. It goes on and on. And it wastes time. And I wanted to hear about what they were most proud of and what their party had achieved most and what was important in this society. Mark, I think one who got partly there was Todd Muller.
I mean, the thing I liked out of Todd Muller's speech, and this will surprise no one, it was the climate change bits, but particularly, where he said actually he was really proud of the Zero Carbon Act establishing the Climate Change Commission, but that it only works if you listen to it, and that we have to listen to the Climate Change Commission, which maybe gets to a general bugbear of mine with valedictories where MPs are willing to say what they really think, because Todd Muller didn't say anything when National rubbished plenty of the ideas of the Climate Change Commission for several years since it was established. It implied that its modelling was wrong or faulty, on and on and on. And then he's leaving so he can say what he really thinks. It's just sort of that symptom of how badly MPs are whipped in New Zealand. We've been it's a big week for American politics as well, and so thinking on American politicians, it's hard to imagine that Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or anyone could say in a parting speech, "Oh, I've always believed in this, but I haven't mentioned it." But that seems to be what you get in just about every MP's speech, where they say what they really think, and it would just be nice if actually they'd stood up for those beliefs while they had the ability to do something about it.
I mean, you could argue that David Parker for the last couple of months has been giving a valedictory speech just about every week, as he's pointed out all of the things that actually he thinks that Labor should be doing. They're just unfortunately not under Chris Hipkins' leadership.
But I think it's important, a party should be not a monolith, right? And so it's nice to see David Parker going, actually, I believe in this. I advocated for it. It didn't win out. That's okay. We move on. But at least, it's not going to be a surprise when he stands up in however many months or weeks or years' time and says, I believed in wealth tax.
I think it's also worth mentioning too, Opito Williams-Seo, he was in his very traditional Pacific address, which was actually nothing on top, but an amazing Pacifica headdress on top and all sorts of things going on, reflecting his, huge mana and influence within the Pacifica community. Talked at length about that ministry, which has obviously been in the spotlight for other reasons in the last week or so, which we are not going to get into at this point. The other thing I want to mention too with Todd Muller's valedictory speech is the sort of second half of it was very much centred around the responsibility that politicians have when it comes to issues around race relations, and the fact that particularly National and Labor, who are the sort of bigger parties of the left and the right, needing to actually just get together around these sorts of issues and stop them being so divisive, especially in the way that they are at the moment in the current climate, particularly post-COVID, and actually just sort of start to formulate policy or at least have a debate in a way that isn't allowing the public and voters to kind of go at it in a particularly angry way, for it to incite anything in particular, and just to kind of pull it back to a clean and fair debate about the issues, which I thought was a good point to raise, given the way that some things have been in recent weeks and months at least. Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you've watched, read or listened to this week that you have enjoyed. Tim?
Well, I was taken by a column on Stuff by Vernon Small, a former insider in this government as a press secretary who's been out for about 6 months. So he gave a quite unique perspective on these things. I liked his opening line, which was, so what's it to be then, this election? A past without a future or a future without a past? Comparing the two parties. It's a good piece.
And Mark?
I really enjoyed Ronan Farrow's piece in The New Yorker on Elon Musk. It's a long piece, but it's a good read. He always does such a good job, and it's slightly surreal to read about some of these things, written in his trademark style with a little bit of the behind the scenes, but also thinking, actually, some of this wasn't that long ago, and it played out very publicly, but rereading it, with this sort of quasi-historical lens to it, it just feels that much more crazy.
What would you define as a long read? Like, how many hours do I need to set aside for this?
Probably an hour.
Ooh,
it's a long one.
Oof. And my recommendation this week is Mark. I alluded to it earlier, your charts that you have got up, which have been updated, I think, every hour, is that right, on Newsroom? Really, really good look at polls for political parties in the lead up to the election across various elections and campaigns over the decades. And of course, political donations as well, which is always very interesting, especially in light of the big numbers that are coming in, big donations that are coming in, particularly for National and ACT at the moment. So check that out on Newsroom. That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer Hugo Stewart and our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to me, joe.moyer@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.